Well, last September, you'll recall, 22-year-old Iranian woman Mahsa Amini died after reportedly being beaten by Iran's morality police for not wearing a hijab as they decreed. Her death caused a wave of protests which saw Iran crack down, and 476 people have been killed by security forces. As always, global outrage ensued, but months on, the issue's been left to fade into the distance. Joining me now is someone who is not forgetting about the cause of women in Iran is Liberal Senator for Tasmania, Claire Chandler, whose bipartisan parliamentary committee has published a report today critical of our government's inaction on Iran. Claire, welcome to Credlin. You're always very welcome here, as you know. Your report, so your committee report, has landed today, not very positive about the omissions from our government. What can you tell us?
Thanks so much for having me on the show, Peter, and Happy New Year. Yes, the Senate did table a report today from the Foreign Affairs Committee, which I chair, into human rights abuses in Iran. And it was very critical of the government's response to this really tragic situation up until now. A couple of really important recommendations coming out of that report: the requirement that the government must list the Islamic Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organisation, that it must fall in line with our international allies and apply further Magnitsky sanctions to individuals within the Iranian regime for human rights abuses. And it needs to look very seriously at the stories in the reports that we heard during the inquiry about foreign interference and intimidation within the Iranian Australian community here at home. So a really important issue and a really important report that sadly has come about because the government has not taken action as decisively as it could have.
What's been the result of the response of Penny Wong? Because you mentioned the Magnitsky Act and its ability to have individual people sanctioned. We pay tribute there to the late Kimberley Kitching. That was her great work, amongst others. But we also know what Penny Wong thought of Kimberley Kitching. There's that and the issue of listing as a terrorist organisation the Revolutionary Guard. Now, if other good allies around the world have done that, it's one of those no-brainers for me that they are on the list. What's been the objection of Australia so far?
Well, that's a really good question, Peter, and I think that's the question that that Australians, and particularly the Iranian diaspora, wanted answered through the course of this inquiry. Unfortunately, the government hasn't really been able to come up with any good reason why we are lagging behind our allies on this front. I know the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, made some comments in question time towards the end of last year about Australia considering our business interests when we think about sanctioning Iran. That makes no sense to me. Australia doesn't maintain significant business interests in Iran, so it is quite a mystery why we are lagging so far behind in sanctioning individuals and also in listing the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. I mean, we've seen advice coming out of the Attorney General's Department just yesterday saying that apparently we don't have the legislative instruments available to do this. If that's the case, then the government should have been asking these questions towards the end of last year, spending some time over the summer coming up with the legislative instruments so we can list the IRGC as a terrorist organisation.
Yeah, it's not rocket science. If you write a 6,000-page essay to kill off capitalism, I think that's where somebody in the government needs to put their attention. Let's go to Scotland. This gender reform legislation, they call it gender recognition, passed the Scottish Parliament. It's still unclear what its status is broadly across the UK. Overnight, though, Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, she's really under fire here. She was lost for words when she was unable to explain why she allowed a 6'5" transgender convicted paedophile to remain in a women's prison. Have a look.
But you've said that you didn't want a male rapist in a female prison. I'm asking you about a transgender person who committed offences against teenage girls in a female toilet. That already happened. She was sent to a women's prison. You don't seem able to tell me whether or not you think that was acceptable.
I'm not going to sort of comment on decisions that have been taken in the past by the prison service on the basis of risk assessments that they have carried out.
Claire, why do these women leaders, have so much trouble standing up for women?
That's the million-dollar question, I think, Peter. That was a pretty galling interview from Nicola Sturgeon, I thought, when I saw that footage yesterday. I mean, this is the same woman and the same government who spent all of this time in the lead up to this legislation passing the parliament insisting that this wasn't something to be concerned about, that men being housed in women's prisons wasn't a natural consequence of the legislation that they were proposing. And even further than that, saying that any person, particularly women who did raise concerns about that happening, were transphobic and bigoted. Now we have the government quickly backtracking. And I mean, this is just unfortunately what happens when a government is coming up with these sort of these pieces of legislation, this gender self-identification legislation, behind closed doors under the cloak of secrecy and silencing any voices of dissent. So unfortunately, we shouldn't be surprised. And it's just a completely unbelievable turnaround from Nicola Sturgeon. Only now that one of these cases has been made public that maybe she realises there's an issue here.
Well, keep up the flight, Claire. It'll be a busy year for you in Canberra. I know you're all back there next week. Thank you for joining us tonight.